in this talk is that we're looking at revolutionary movements, or radical movements, anti-systemic movements, anti-capitalist movements. I think it's pretty clear, easy to say they have a certain frequency, a certain resonance. So you see, movements tend to come in cycles. And at the same point, in technology, I think you often have some of the same effects. So technology is often viewed as coming in cycles. So for example, you had the explosion of the web, which I think probably you may remember, Arturo. But yeah, the explosion of the web, 93, 94. Then you have sort of the web 2.0, Twitter, Facebook, 2004, around 2008. Now things are moving again. So you tend to, there seems to be a lot of innovation happens in cycles, effectively. And at the same point, what I noticed is actually that the general theory of innovation is that, I don't know how many people here have done entrepreneurship courses or whatnot, but that innovation happens in cycles, they claim. That there's essentially a large amount of investors who then maybe give money to some smart kid, they go out and form a business, the smart kid has some genius concept, such as Facebook or Twitter, or if they're lucky, and they make a startup, and either it succeeds or it fails in the market, and this creates some wonderful new scaling technology. Now I think what's important to remember, from my perspective, the thesis I'm sort of arguing for, is that actually a lot of the innovation, a lot of the invention, comes actually from social movements trying to harness the power of technology to solve some very concrete social problems that they're facing. And then later, we may have companies move in and try to commercialize this. So I'm going to start back with the first web, but just to give a sort of broader background, don't think this phenomenon is confined to the internet. Bernard Stiegler, in particular, has this theory of grammatization, which comes from Sylvain Leroux. And the general point is that technology is not sort of just computers or devices or pens and papers or books, but it's essentially how we inscribe our memory and our intelligence and our collective way of being, our collective individuation, into the world. So without, it's kind of obvious. If you look at a young baby without any techniques, they're useless. They don't have the ability, they're very easily killed, they can't fend for themselves, they need a family to take care of them. Later, if you look at as cultures develop, generally, they have some level of technical development. These techniques from language onwards essentially inscribe the possibilities, the capabilities, the capacities of the person. And what I want to point out here is that the big revolutionary move we had historically was probably the invention of the written word. Spoken language, probably the largest sort of revolution in terms of memory. And what people tend to forget is that this had tremendous political consequences, various religious wars, the Enlightenment, and that was considered sort of one large phase. And actually, I think the internet is simply another move in direction. It's a dramatic change in the kind of way that we can store and retrieve memories and the way we communicate, and as such, it will have giant political effect. There's no way around it. And what I'm trying to trace in this talk is also some of the histories of how new social movements have arisen and used this kind of internet-driven technology to try to change the world. And that's part of this larger technical picture, where we're not saying technology determines how social movements act or determines anything, really, but we say it provides new possibilities, new capacities. And these possibilities and capacities are shaped by the values put into technology, and we'll go back to that shortly. So when I got to UNC, the first sort of the protest I really remember was the anti-globalization movement, which I don't know, probably very few people here remember, but it was sort of interesting. It was essentially we at UNC, partially due to sweatshop we discovered that a lot of the UNC sports clothes were made in sweatshops. We started communicating with people, Indonesian workers, union representatives, and we started understanding our complicity in a sort of larger, effectively, world and global capitalism. And we felt that it was unfair that UNC basically was producing sweatshop goods and started protesting against this. However, this made us aware of larger issues, such as the various free trade agreements happening. One of the earliest free trade agreements was an agreement by the OECD, a sort of collection of relatively advanced nations, to basically have what was called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, which basically said you cannot discriminate in terms of investment based on a company's environmental or labor track records. That would actually be illegal, it could be taken to court. This was going to be thrown through the OECD. They had a large meeting in Vancouver. And around this time, at least myself and all other people in the anti-globalization movement really discovered mailing lists. So just as, and I think you guys still use them, but they're kind of not nearly as useful as Facebook. I imagine most people came here not because they discovered it over a mailing list, but over Facebook. But in 98, mailing list was all we had, but it allowed us to organize globally. And that let people say, hey, we should have a big protest. There hadn't been very large protests, at least in the recent memory. So we helped organize one in Vancouver, which was relatively small. But it was sort of interesting because it was sort of the first big protest against the globally coordinated support from people in Indonesia, support from all these countries that are going to be screwed by the MAI in Canada. And then around the same time in Canada was a weird nexus of activity at the time. There was one of the first radical web servers, radical groups, called DAO. DAO.ca, obviously in Canada, basically wanted to create little networks of radical technology co-ops and servers. The internet was still kind of new over the world. And they would host websites and mailing lists, and you get emails. And a lot of people, including myself, got very excited when we discovered this. But it wasn't, so people started setting up mailing lists, the emails, and we had ownership over that part of the technology. But we noticed that the MAI, you had this big protest, and at UNC we had these sweatshop protests, but we still really had trouble getting the message out. So we would be in the streets, people would be arrested. It's almost like it never happened because the strangle of the corporate media was so tight at the time that it would not even get into television. This all changed in '99 at the Battle of Seattle, Seattle Anti-World Trade Organization protest. And one of the reasons that changed just wasn't that protest was large. It was fairly large, 50,000 some people, and did manage to shut the meeting down. But what was really interesting was at this moment, a lot of activists coming out of DAO, particularly coming out of something called the Direct Action Media Network, DAM, hilariously enough, we realized that we really needed to work together to get the message out. And to get the message out, we wanted a website which was new at the time, no one was really doing this, where people could contribute to the content of the website. And we decided that, at the protest itself, we would set up a sort of media center where people could upload videos, upload photos, it was really slow at the time, and other things. And that's what it looked like, actually. So that's the first of the media site, coming out in sort of 99, basically coming out of the Seattle protest, and then immediately, so it's very simple, but you can see anyone could just sort of submit a story, and it had, and there was always a problem, how do we censor it, do we not censor it, do we read the stories, just put them up? Generally we just put them up, and then later we would maybe go through and clean up stuff that was either false or possibly crazy anti-Semitic stuff and whatnot. But in general, it was really useful. And all of a sudden, even though it was very primitive, the software actually came from an activist group in Australia called Active. Every protest would set up a new indie media center. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, would have a meeting in Prague, and we would follow the International Monetary Fund there, and we would have get a bunch of computers together, a bunch of actors would fly over. South America, Brazil was a real stronghold of indie media, so we had Brazilian activists flying to Prague, meeting with North American activists, meeting with local Czech activists, say, hey, you guys also need an indie media center. So we would set that up. And you can see we got a little bit more fancy. We had photos. Things slowly started upgrading. And these are quite exciting at the time. And eventually, what was happening, you notice that the mainstream journalists, because they couldn't figure out what was going on the street, actually started going to indie media. But at this time, we didn't have smartphones. So essentially, you would literally go to the protest, then run to a building where there was a bunch of computers, and sit down, and then upload your photos or your video and write little stories. So there's this real lag time. It wasn't live. There was no live streaming. But regardless, these sites started getting lots and lots of traffic, and they really exploded. After only 2 years, we had 89 indie medias on 6 continents, including the West Bank, everywhere but Antarctica. That's in only 2 years. People kept setting up the software. Everywhere there's a protest, people felt there should be an indie media. I believe we set up indie media North Carolina, maybe 2002, if I remember correctly. Originally with iBooks, then eventually I set it up, it was hosted on Sunside.biblio, and then eventually moved over to Asheville, and then at some point died in the last few years. But it was around for quite a while. It's unclear if indie media is really necessary right now, but we'll get back to that. But in 2004, which is really not that long ago, we had over 150 indie media centers. And this is another one I set up in Scotland. So you can see, we can hold buildings together. And interestingly enough, the numbers of indie media centers seem to be most important in places where there was really problems getting the message out, right? So the United States had the most indie media centers, because they actually had one of the worst corporate media in the entire planet. What's another country that had terrible corporate media about the first decade of 2000? Berlusconi in Italy. So indie media ended up being incredibly crucial in Italy. In a very small country, it had over 39 indie medias pop up. And many of the most active volunteers were Italian. And we kept going with these. So, we set up New York indie media. There was a protest against the Republican National Convention in 2004. So this is Bush's re-inauguration. A few things happened. It wasn't that big. Puppets got set on fire. But what was really interesting in 2004 was actually something we didn't really even notice. I mean, we were using, but no one thought about as really revolutionary, which was a program called TextMob. So this is what phones looked like in 2004. So no photos. But people could text. It's sort of new, and it's still pretty cheap. And a group called the Institute for Applied Autonomy, the guy who's a grad student at MIT Media Lab at the time, Tad Hirsch, and a fairly anonymous person who will only known as John Henry, basically set up a service called TextMob. TextMob had this sort of terrifying web interface. You had to sign up and test it, and you would make groups. But then the cool thing is, you could message from the street using your text message, your mobile phone, everyone in your group. Effectively, WhatsApp, or I don't know what people use now. What do people use?
WhatsApp.
Well, people use WhatsApp in Europe. It seems to change depending on what country you're in. But basically, WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or whatever in 2004. But, the first people who created this, there was anyone else doing it, was actually activists, right? Activists actually, I think, started that. And what's really interesting here is that from TextMob, there was a hilarious, sort of interesting problem, which is people were using it. It maxed out. I think we only had that many people. I think there was 2 systems actually. Ruckus Society had something else. UCOM, I think. We had about 5,000 people using this text messaging system. And it actually got to the point where T-Mobile decided to shut it down during the protest. So it was sort of mini internet blackout, Mubarak style, we can't take these people text messaging, running away from the cops. So we're just going to shut the whole thing down. So we actually started getting blocked, the servers we were using. And so 2 very clever programmers, a guy called Nicholas Freitas, who now does the Guardian project, Orbot, if you use Tor on your phone, he's still doing great stuff. And Evan Hinshaw-Plath and a few other coders basically sat down, reworked TextMob, fixed a lot of the code, and made it much more efficient, but also had a very clever way to avoid the censorship devices, where effectively they made a Java applet that if you loaded indie media, and you could say, keep the web page open to have solidarity with the protesters, and there was a way you could discover given a phone, we had a database of everyone's phone numbers, right? That given someone's phone number, and you had a message to them, you could use what was essentially, at the time, an email to text message gateway. You could figure out from the phone number what provider they were on and use that gateway over the internet, which would go around, effectively, the blocking. And so essentially by keeping a little Java applet, a little program running in your web browser, it would start routing the messages through the more direct T-Mobile blockade, which is very interesting. And that worked to some extent. And so text mob, I think, was quite revolutionary. Now, indie media itself had a lot of issues. So one of the larger issues. Let me get to the web browser real quick. Eventually, it basically got. It got massively repressed. And so just so you guys know what it looks like. So there was a raid on the Indie Media Center at during G8 in 2001, where the police would actually, in order to stop the protesters from communicating, would come in. So this is kind of what it looked like. Would come in and basically nearly kill people, beat them up, throw them in jail. So a lot of people were nearly killed during this raid, and as you saw, as Indie Media grew, and we had sort of, I don't know if we have any eerie pictures of that. As it grew, we had, there was more and more repression. Sites would get shut down during a protest. The Indie Media Center would kind of always get raided. You didn't really want to be the computer guy because you would get arrested. And then, interestingly enough, the movement itself slowly started to kind of disintegrate due to the amount of sort of post-9/11 repression. But two of the programmers from Indie Media, so this is Evan Hinshaw-Plath, otherwise known as Anarcho-Geek or Rabble, and Blaine Cook. I think you might know Blaine. Blaine, otherwise known as Lattice, from resist.ca, one of the local DAO nodes, basically said, you know, we're going to take a little break. We're going to go, we need some money. We're all living in our cars and whatnot. And so we're going to go work for a startup called Odeo. And Odeo was a startup founded by Ev Williams that was into this new thing at the time called podcasting, where you could listen to audio on your phone and your computer. It was great. You could preload them. And they basically get involved in Odeo. It's a little startup. And then what happens is Apple comes out with essentially podcasting built in to their new system, their new iTunes. This, of course, immediately kills their sort of software. So what do you do with a startup? You've spent all your investor money. You've hired a few anarchist programmers. It's looking bad for Odeo. So one of the interesting things is in 2005, they were still using text mob. So it was used at a May Day big anti-immigrant solidarity march. I think in 2006 in May Day in San Fran. And this, they said, well, I think this text mob thing is kind of cool. So we're gonna demo it. So everyone who was working at Odeo got a text mob account, and they tried it, and they talked about what worked and what didn't, and that terrible web sign-up process was clearly too complicated, and the interface, maybe needed some help. But regardless, there was a lot of interest in that sort of in text mob, and so when they were trying to figure out, well, we don't have much money, Noah Glass and Jack Dorsey and other folks went off, and they built something that was basically a status update mechanism, which originally had a hilarious name, Friend Stalker. Called something else. But eventually they renamed it Twitter after debates. But Twitter eventually, basically came, a lot of the concepts were in the air because of text mob. because of that. So you instead of figuring, hey, where's the riot police? You're like, hey, where's the party? What are you doing right now? So it's sort of text mob on, but all the time. That's where this ridiculous 104. I know do people remember early Twitter? You could get it on your phone. Yeah. Okay. So that's where that came from, right? So the character limits came from its sort of heritage, essentially, as a mobile device. Eventually, people have internet now on their phones all the time, so it's kind of just a relic. But regardless, I think it's sort of interesting seeing how those activists who then got hired by Odeo basically gets the concept of something like text mob in the air, and then when you have to build when Odeo had to pivot and become Twitter, those concepts become quite crucial in part of Twitter's design. And Evan was fired from Odeo, and the anarchist, he was actually, I think, maybe their first real coder, but he had all this stock in Odeo, which became Twitter stock, and I believe his roommate, who was a activist coder, said, this thing's just going to become another surveillance machine, so he sold it for like $7,000 or something. It does happen, he's fine. He eventually became a millionaire through other means. But, it's Silicon Valley. He did another startup or two. Blaine Cook stayed with Twitter, became their first CTO, and was basically, you remember early Twitter would sort of go down a lot? There was this whale picture. So that was Blaine's fault, basically. So he designed the initial Ruby on Rails backbone for Twitter, and that was built because there was originally a framework, an earlier non-Ruby Perl-based framework, started him and Ravel working on called Riot, which was originally this sort of activist coding framework. They decided to switch to Ruby because it did more or less the things that Riot was trying to do. And Blaine, tried to build, I think Blaine, a lot of the things which succeeded about Twitter came from good intent, a lot of activists coding it. So when Blaine basically was really into open APIs, it's kind of before, now everyone does open APIs, but in 2005 and 6, it was still kind of new. So Blaine said, we should make our API open, everyone should be able to access the data, we should try to get it out there as much as possible. Originally, and at least in the back of Blaine's head, he wanted Twitter to be more decentralized. So a lot of that, how can people access Twitter data from other services, and a lot of that got built into a standard called OAuth. So whenever you use, for example, when you sign into Facebook, and Facebook's like, hey, I want to access your Gmail, this is usually what happens, or something like that. That's done through a standard called OAuth that came out of early Twitter and Blaine. Of course, as another anarchist who was eventually fired before the IPO, and luckily he kept his stock. And eventually, the company goes IPO, and now is, of course, in trouble. And now, not surprisingly, because a lot of the coders at Twitter are friends, in the Republican National Convention protest in 2008, it did occur to people that, it's been 4 years since text mob, and now there's this new thing called Twitter, which is kind of like a better version of text mob. And we should use this to tell protesters where the cops are on the street. And we're gonna do the same thing. We have a communication center. We'll have scouts on bicycles to check the information. We'll have a Twitter stream, and that was all set up. And then, of course, not surprisingly, halfway during the protest, I was in the Twitter center actually, and someone says, "Hey, the police are coming." I'm like, "Oh, this is terrible. This never ends well." So I get out via window.
Wow.
and then essentially, luckily, Elliot and Smokey and other people basically get out through windows. Other people stay. Those people are arrested. The police shut down the communication center. But of course, it being Twitter, it still runs even without the communication center. And it was probably the largest innovation of that protest, even though we didn't realize at the time, was the use of Twitter to basically organize, get people involved, and tell them what's going on the streets. And this, spreads, right? There's actually a case where this fellow right here gets charged with, they didn't really know what to call Twitter at the time, so they charged Elliot with criminal use of a device. And he gets eventually, the the local police can't really pin him, so those charges get dropped. His house gets raided because the FBI decide that this actually is a federal crime, using Twitter to organize protests. And the police discover my notebook in the Twitter, even though it's more or less marginally involved in that. But they discover my notebook in the raid. And they say, oh, look, we have your notebook. We know you were involved in organizing the central nervous system of the protest. You know, there's some sort of grand jury. People, you know, house raids are going on. But after 2 or 3 years, in which my lawyer says, just stay out the country if possible, the grand jury comes to an end, and they can't really get any charges that stick. So eventually, everything ends up okay, and Elliot is luckily a free man. However, what happens is Elliot and the anarchists at the Republican National Convention were really pioneering a new form of protest. So you see it in 2008 in September, and then, I don't know, have anyone been to Moldova? I've been to Moldova. It's a great place. You definitely go. It's a really small Eastern European country, the Soviet breakaway republic that still has a KGB called Transnistria, and it's really corrupt. And so the people, they're sick of the corruption, they take to the streets, and weirdly enough, they're all on Twitter. Twitter's a big deal in Moldova. That's how people communicate. And so they basically, not surprisingly, try to organize, and fail, organize a revolution using Moldova using Twitter. And then, a few months afterwards, this is the one everyone knows about, it happens in Iran. There's the election in Iran. People feel the protest is somehow, might really spark an overthrow of the government, that there was a fraud, and at this point, there's so much traffic going on Twitter that Twitter is going to go down for maintenance, and Jared Cohen, who's now at Google, who at this time is at the State Department, actually calls Twitter. It's like, if you shut down your server for maintenance, the revolution will fail. So, don't turn it off, and they keep it on. And all, people on Twitter say, wow, there's all these people with little green flags joining our service. And that revolution is crushed as well. However, the theme keeps happening, because at this point, everyone on the planet is getting a smartphone. And more people are getting on Twitter. And eventually kicks off in Tunisia. And we'll go into that in a second. And then, of course, reaches probably its most well-known success in Egypt. I was in Egypt. It's really funny. I really don't use Twitter that much. I find it kind of irritating. I don't like this whole public thing and the character limit. But, I'm in Egypt. I'm at the protest. I'm like, oh, what should I do? Where should I go? And the Egyptians are like, aren't you on Twitter? I was like, oh, where's the Indie Media Center? Like, they don't know. Like, yeah, everything's on Twitter. Just follow these hashtags. Oh, I don't speak Arabic. Google Translate Arabic is terrible. But regardless, it is actually, Tunisia had a high Facebook element. But it was actually one of the reasons why it seemed to work a little bit in Tunisia and Egypt. So I don't want to say that Twitter or Facebook caused the revolution. I don't think that's true. But it provided something else quite crucial, which provided two things. These were both heavily surveilled societies. And it was really hard to get people together on the street. And there's a lot of people who were very angry at the government. The economy was terrible. You couldn't really speak your mind. You couldn't organize politically. Didn't have freedom to assemble, really. No freedom of speech. But what was sort of interesting is that the governments were not really into the internet. So they didn't really understand this whole other planet going on the internet where people could gather, talk to each other, chat on Facebook pages and in Twitter. And that essentially provided a safe space for people to organize. And because more people were getting smartphones, when things happened, it told you what was going on. So I remember in Egypt, when the Egyptian Revolution happened, Egyptian news was just showing, pictures of the palace, nature or something. I mean, really, it was just pretending it wasn't happening at all. But the entire world, including journalists, but also many people, were really active on Twitter and Facebook. Tunisia actually had the highest internet penetration in Africa. It had actually probably more people on than many countries in Europe. A bit less so in Egypt. We had a very tight, I would say, kind of sophisticated group working on all the protests. And then, of course, when you turn the internet off, everyone's like, well, really, what's going on? And the first thing that ever goes is that year, and the government is overthrown. I think the thing I want to point out is that what happened is an interesting question. Why was Twitter successful in organizing protests in 2011? Well, because people have been using that technology to do that since 2004. And anarchists had really been dealing with questions such as what happens when they turn off the mobile phones? What happens when they turn off the internet? What happens when we're raided? We've been dealing with the situation and learning about it for years and years and years. Now, what I would say the anarchists were pretty terrible at doing was they're terrible at making it user friendly. Text mob, as you saw, was really hard to use, and they were terrible at really getting into the hands of ordinary people. So, at the Republican National Convention protest, the only people who had text mob were, of course, people who were there for the protest. So normal people wouldn't get the message like they did in the Occupy and come out to the protest because of social media, because only people who sort of came there with an explicit purpose would be on text mob. And we saw the situation get a bit better in 2008, but at that point, penetration of Twitter was still, among geeks was very high, among normal people, not great, but pretty good. And now, of course, everyone's on it. And so I think you can sort of say that even though Twitter is on some level a capitalist company who really doesn't really care about protests. I mean, there's no way, there's no, I would say, secret radicals. They've all been fired, I think, still working inside Twitter. Somehow some of the values, such as open APIs, such as low latency communication, such as general openness, were basically embedded in that technology from the beginning by some of the programmers who came from social movements. And some of the same concepts, which were used at first by a very small minority of crazy people, anarchists, were then essentially commercialized, became this giant hit. Right? I think it's a really interesting cycle. And then, lo and behold, 2011, I was on Twitter, it's just so we can follow, I don't know, Kim Kardashian or whatever. And then, lo and behold, its original use, which is, where are the police on the street, comes back. And that's quite, I think, quite an interesting story. Now, the thing which is more interesting, though, than the past is the future. So what is coming out of the next generation of technologies? So I would like to first thing point out something which is not particularly always well received, but it's a really funny little short video, so we're going to watch it. This is...
The sound.
Where's
the sound? That button right there on the video. Yeah.
Oh, no. Yes.
Full screen flash.
20 secure phones to assist in staying anonymous, $5,000. Fighting legal cases across 5 countries, $1 million. Upkeep of servers in over 40 countries, $200,000. Donations lost due to banking blockade, $15 million. Added cost due to house arrest, $500,000. Watching the world change as a result of your work? Priceless. There are some people who don't like change. For everyone else, there's WikiLeaks. To find out more about WikiLeaks' financial blockade and how to donate, please visit wikileaks.org/support.html.
So the first time I heard about WikiLeaks, I think it was the end of 2008 or 2009. I was in Berlin. Cancel it before it starts something else.
No.
Oh no.
We killed it.
So we'll do another video later. But is the there was a talk given on WikiLeaks, which was I think probably one of the earlier public talks, and I was like, well, it's sort of interesting, but the early concept behind WikiLeaks was a little bit more complicated as dumping documents. Originally, the reason for WikiLeaks is because there was originally a media wiki site attached. We were supposed to imagine that the people themselves would crowdsource the editorials of these news releases. And Julian Assange gave this great talk at Chaos Computer Congress about freedom of information, and I went out afterwards. Jake Applebaum was there, and I said, well, look, we've done this with indie media already. I don't think social movements are failing because of lack of information. give people tons of information, and they just don't care. So I don't really see how this WikiLeaks thing is going to work. And not only that, but if you're releasing, you're probably just going to get, we got a lot of trouble. At this point, I was in trouble because of Twitter and various other things. And I said, look, you're going to get, the FBI's going to hit you guys. They hit us for Twitter. You're going to get hit harder. And I remember Jake said, oh, we're not dissidents. We just make tools for dissidents. I said, oh, the FBI doesn't care about the difference between these things. And then, not surprisingly, when it does get launched, they get hit really hard. At the same point, where I was wrong, and I've told Assange this, and I admitted my mistake, is that what I understand was that the certain kinds of documents have all power, particular documents which were indeed secret. And while, the Iraq War documents, I think, it's unclear if they really helped in ending the Iraq War. However, it is sort of undeniable, I think, that the documents that were leaked about bin Ali's relationship with the United States and Tunisia had no effect. Actually, they had a huge effect. So sometimes with these revolutions, you can say, oh, well, it's sort of obvious, the economy is terrible, the people that are being oppressed will rise up. But in Tunisia, bin Ali had been in power for like 20 or 30 years. And the economy had always been kind of about the same. It did sort of terrible. There's no large amount of oil there. But what was different was that the people kind of had it, I think, a little bit in their head that if there was a big revolt, our good friends in NATO would come in and, Europe would invade, France would send over troops, and it'd be game over for any revolution in Tunisia. But what was sort of interesting is that Sahim, Mahmoud, and other people, when the cable leaks happened, they went through a lot of the leaks, and they said, hey, look, there's some leaks about Tunisia, some leaks about Ben Ali. And it was basically the State Department saying, yeah, Ben Ali has so much money, he's like feeding chickens to his pet tigers, and, it was ridiculous. And also, yeah, he's really, even the U.S. government's like, he's really corrupt. If there's a revolt and people decide to overthrow him, we're not really going to back Ben Ali. And so when that became public, that this was the secret communiques in the State Department, that actually the U.S. government was not a huge fan of their dictator, I think this probably helped in making people feel they could come to the streets and really help overthrow the government. It really hurt Ben Ali's image and I think grip over the situation. And we'll go back to that. But of course, one interesting question is, what are the new technologies that have had effects? So, I guess you could more or less say, I don't think the 2011 revolt would have happened in Tunisia without WikiLeaks. I think that caused the blockade, the sort of domino effect, which led to Egypt, Libya, and eventually back to the U.S. and Occupy. What is the underlying technology, which is at the same place that TextMob was, 10 years ago? I think one of the technologies, which I'm sure you guys are familiar, some of you might be familiar with, is Tor hidden services. So really, WikiLeaks is great, but the real sort of technical machinery behind it is essentially, how do you submit things anonymously to WikiLeaks? Well, they have a Tor hidden service. And you can drop off documents there, and then they actually don't know who you are. So Assange is not lying when he says, hey, I have no idea that Manning dropped off these documents, because they actually, even on the IP address level, have been anonymized. So Tor basically anonymizes your IP address, and a Tor hidden service, Tor's been around for a very long time. I think the first paper was out in 2002, and it's been maturing for very long. But only in, I remember speaking, actually, with Roger about Tor, and he's like, yeah, there's hidden services, no one's really using them for anything, maybe we should cut them, I don't know. And then, lo and behold, Julian Assange gives the killer app for a hidden website, which is uploading secret documents. And Tor hidden service is just a server in the cloud, which basically, you don't know the server's IP address, the server is hidden. It's very hard from looking into the cloud to detect where the server is, but you can still access it via Tor. And of course, post WikiLeaks, a lot of people have discovered this. In particular, of course, the big one is Silk Road. Everyone now buys drugs over the internet. Effectively, it's kind of cool almost, using Tor hidden services for the most part. At the same point, these are being raided. I don't think it's because of the fundamental flaw in Tor. I just think because Tor hidden services, Tor is fine for, of course, web surfing. Hidden services haven't really been thoroughly looked at yet. So there's probably a lot of technical work to be done with Tor hidden services to determine how to make what WikiLeaks is doing, how to make an anonymous website really anonymous. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, I think Nakamoto released the code in like 2008, 2009, but no one knew about it. It was just this weird alternative, cryptocurrency. Maybe these things have been kind of floating around as e-gold, e-cash.